If you were born in the 18th or 19th century, you would have to be extremely lucky to hear a symphony. But nowadays saying something like this is funny because you have any music you want accessible to you in a few seconds. And if you have a cool sound system, the music experience is even better. A lot of people think that the history of music started the day we learned how to write notes, or learned how to invent and learn instruments. But this is completely wrong, because music has been around much longer than that. Throughout history, you can find all types of fossils that give you a type of record about history. But for music, you really can't find anything, because your voice or any sound does not fossilize. To understand the history of music, you have to look at it more broadly, because throughout the world it was very similar up until recently. Before we move forward, you have to know in the year 1877, Thomas Edison invented the phonograph, and this was the first time you could not only record voice, but record music as well. So this means before the year 1878, there is no recorded sound or voice. But you might say, how does Beethoven music still exist? He lived much before this date. It's not that Beethoven's music exists in sound form, it's because he wrote notes and they still remain to this day, and you could read these notes and play the music. It's not the actual sound that remains in history. But Beethoven is still not the beginning of music. We have to go many years into the past. What is the first ever instrument? It's the human voice. The human voice, unlike any other animal, was able to change and make it more entertaining and more beautiful. And since the human was much more intelligent, they could change the voice to make it seem more cooler. Basically, this caused the humans to not only enjoy it themselves, but the people around them would enjoy it as well. Alongside the human voice, there were other inventions that helped people out to have entertainment. And there were different types of instruments. Like this stone instrument you're seeing in front of you was created in Tanzania, and we're not sure how old it is. It could be several thousand years old, and maybe even 100,000 years old. And since the rocks aren't really fossilized and they're not organized, they all make a different sound, so it's not uniform. In this era, the Homo habilis and the Homo erectus used to live. So it would be amazing if these people actually had access to these types of instruments. But the first instrument that was actually made by hand, and in a way it was engineered to make music, was this flute in front of you. This instrument you're seeing is about 40,000 years old, and it was found in the cave in southern Germany. The reason this flute fossilized is that it was made by bone, vulture bone to be exact. So this still does not tell us that this is the oldest instrument in history, because you could have much older instrument than this 40,000-year-old one, but it was made with a different material like wood, and it would decompose very easily in nature and get destroyed and lost in history. But since this was made from animal bone, it remained. In this era, not only did Neanderthals live, but Homo sapiens lived as well, and we're not sure which one of these guys made it. But all we know is that they were both very creative and very intelligent for their time. Before human civilization came along, every person was a hunter-gatherer. And when you're a hunter-gatherer, you do not remain in one spot of the world. You're always on the move to go somewhere better and better. And you moving means you have to move throughout the seasons. So this means if you have a heavy instrument, you're not able to take it with you anywhere you go. That's why you have a very small flute or just your voice. So this means you can't create pianos. The biggest you can go is this little flute. The Pygmies in Cameroon also had their own type of instrument that they play to this day. The Pygmies are the shortest people in the world, and their instrument is very interesting. And since they use different types of branches every time they play it, it always sounds different. But it seems like they have a very good time when they're playing it. But let's get back to music history. People advance and we get to farming. And when you get to farming, that's basically the start of civilizations. And the first civilizations were formed around large bodies of water, like Mesopotamia and the Nile River in Egypt. When civilization was formed, it slowly turned into villages, and villages turned into cities. When you live in a village and cities, that's when you live in a group next to other people. These people get bored and like to hang out with one another. And when they're hanging out, one of the things they do is play music and sing for one another. One guy can sing better than the other, so they allow him to take the wheel so they can have a much better time. And just like this, music advances and people create different instruments to make different noises just to make that music sound better. When civilization is formed, the human is not a hunter-gatherer anymore. They can create instruments that are bigger and heavier because they don't have to move it anymore. And you could say this was the first time that different instruments that we see a resemblance of today is being made. The oldest instrument that had strings, kind of like an ancient guitar, was made 13,000 years ago in Africa. And you could say this is the foundation of the harp and guitar. And from there, it started to evolve throughout the world. We eventually get to the year 1020. An Italian man by the name of Guido of Arezzo changes the music world forever because he was the first person to come up with music notes. It didn't take very long for this type of music and writing notes to take over the world, and each part of the world had their own culture and style to it. But in Europe, since most of the power went to the church, the only music you were able to practice, make, and pass around to the people was church music. Anything else was forbidden. This law stays put for centuries on end, and eventually we get to the 15th century. In this era, the power of the church is declining, and this allows people to make their own type of music that has nothing to do with church anymore. And you could say this is basically when Western music is starting to be made. When notes were created, you could say this is the first time that you could turn music that was something that you would hear out loud and turned it into something that's solid. Basically, you could write with it. And not only would this music stay in history, but it would allow people to learn it easier. Even with all that, 99.9% of the people could not hear this type of music whatsoever. The only music they had available to them was their own voice, their family and friends' voice, and maybe an instrument they would hear sometimes. But only a select few would be able to hear a symphony. When Thomas Edison created the phonograph in the year 1878, it allowed different types of people to hear a type of recording and different types of music. But still, this was not available to everybody. Until more than 60 years passes, and in the year 1940, the first record player was made. And certain parts of the world you could buy records and play your own music. And you could say we're getting slowly closer to having access to different types of music quickly. After record players, we turn into cassettes. Cassettes turn into CDs, and we get to the year 1998, where another revolution happens in the music industry. Because now you can put your music onto a digital device called the MP3 player. 3 years later, in the year 2001, Apple and Steve Jobs cause another revolution. They come out with a brand new iPod. The iPod was the first device that was able to hold 1,000 songs and have a battery life of 10 hours. Before this, the most amount of music you could put on high-end CDs was 99 songs, and this was only a select few types of CDs. So what Steve Jobs and Apple did was revolutionary. And after this, everything is growing exponentially. You slowly get to a point where anyone in the world has access to all the music of the world at a click of a button. There are places in the world where they don't have clean running water and proper food, but they have access to music devices like MP3 players and iPods, where they have access to all types of music. Slowly, it seems like we're getting rid of classic instruments, and they're all turning into electronic noises that make instrument noises. Soon we're gonna get into a point where musicians are all gonna be sitting behind their computer and making music with the computer instead of an instrument. And you could say this is kind of creative, but it doesn't have that special feeling anymore. Maybe someone learning to play an instrument and learning notes is gonna be in history, but you never know. People love classical things.